Yeah, you don't have to stand in the back. You can come in and sit down.
So sleep and recovery are integral to athletic performance, though it's often the most ignored aspect. And I'm going to talk about how, if you can see that slide, the different factors that influence performance. These include, sorry, trying to figure this out. Diet, hydration, and training. The player's innate cognitive as well as physical abilities, mental preparation and experience, as well as coaching. And I'm going to show you how sleep and circadian rhythms actually influence each and every one of these aspects. So to that end, I have divided this talk into 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about why sleep is important to the athlete. Then we're going to talk about how much sleep athletes need to win. And then finally, we're going to talk about the science of sleep. So what modulates alertness and performance during the day? So the first is why sleep is important to the athlete. When much to the chagrin of sleep scientists like me, we really don't know why we sleep. We don't know what the function of sleep is. We know we spend 1/3 of our life sleeping. But we know what happens if you don't get enough sleep. And that has very major implications on athletes. So the number one reason you need enough sleep is because if you don't get enough sleep, if instead of getting your 8 hours, if you're getting 6 to 7 hours, you double or triple your normal reaction time. Normal reaction time is about a quarter of a second. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is what happens to this deficit. So these deficits in your performance actually accumulate over time and sort of become non-recoverable. So this is a study. It's a performance. It's a sleep deprivation study that looks at performance. And if you can, I don't know how to use the pointer in this, but can somebody help me? How do I use a pointer? There's no pointer? Okay. So this is how the study is designed. Yes, these are sleep deprivation studies. The same individual goes through 4 different periods. So for 7 days, they're spending either 9 hours in bed, followed by 3 days of recovery sleep, which is again 9 hours. And they compare them to people who are spending 7 hours in bed, followed by 3 days of 9 hours in bed, recovery sleep. So 7, 5 versus 3 hours in bed. And as you can see, your mean speed, which is on that side, and the number of lapses keep increasing. And as the days of sleep deficit increase, that impairment gets worse and worse. And when you get these 3 days of 9 hours in bed, they recover, but they're never as good as the people who get 9 hours of sleep on a regular basis. So I tell my athletes, the athlete that I talk to, so it's not just important to sleep just the couple of nights before your game. It's important what you do, the amount of sleep you get regularly leading up to the game. In fact, there are studies that show that right before your game, athletes kind of sleep poorly. It's because they're kind of anxious. And they may be sleeping in a strange environment. So the one way you combat that is by making sure you get enough sleep on a regular basis. The second reason you need sleep is because you need sleep to play the intelligent game. So that's a PET scan of sleep-deprived individuals. So when you're sleep-deprived, you know that groggy feeling you get as if you're not quite there? Well, actually, the prefrontal cortex is the one that's most impaired. Now, your prefrontal cortex is what deals with good judgment, multitasking, making the right decision. And there's actually one part of the brain that lights up if you don't get enough sleep. And that is your emotional brain. So when you make decisions, when you're sleep-deprived, it's when your emotional brain is much more active than the judgment part of the brain. So that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, that has profound implications for the athletes. Athletes have to make split-second decisions, in time crunch situations. The number of fouls increased if you don't get enough sleep. Also, it's very important that you don't want to let the opposing team get to your head. So that's another place where you want to make sure you get enough sleep because you want to be able to shut that extra emotional brain out. And the third reason why you want to get enough sleep, why sleep is important for athletes, is because it's been shown that the number of hours of sleep profoundly affects the likelihood of getting injured. So these are high school athletes. They were followed for about 22 months, and they found that the number of hours of sleep had the strongest prediction for the likelihood of getting injured. If you slept less than 8 hours, your likelihood of developing injury increased by 1.7%. Also, you need sleep to recover, for muscle recovery, because that sort of makes sense. If you don't get enough sleep, your reaction time is increased, your visual acuity is decreased, so of course you're going to get more injured. But also, the hormones that you need to recover mostly are secreted during your sleep. So growth hormone is secreted during deep sleep. Also, testosterone, which is essentially secreted while you're sleeping and has another peak while you're awake, is secreted while you're sleeping. So there's an experiment in which they took young, healthy college students, and instead of giving them 8 hours in bed, they sleep deprived them by 5 hours, and they found that their testosterone levels decreased by 10 to 12%. And now, normally, with aging, your testosterone levels decrease by 1 to 2% per year. So for a 20-year-old player, just by not sleeping for a week, their testosterone levels were now that of a 31-year-old. Nobody wants that. Testosterone is really important for players. You need it for muscle mass, for that sense of vigor and well-being, but you also need it because it gives you a little sense of aggression that you need on the field. So that's another reason it's important. Also, when you're sleep deprived, all the hormones that actually break down muscle, they increase. So that's a third reason why athletes need sleep. Now, there are studies done in the Henry Ford Sleep Lab that looked at pain sensitivity, and they found that getting less sleep actually makes you more sensitive to pain, which is a bad thing, because first of all, if you're still feeling pain, you feel you haven't recovered, right? And then if you're still in pain, you're going to want more pain medications, and that affects your performance the next day. And then, of course, there are studies done out of University of Chicago. They took, again, healthy young college students, so they're only people who will volunteer to be part of these studies. And they sleep deprived them, and they found that just by a week or 10 days of sleep deprivation, they were no longer metabolizing their glucose. Nutrition plays a big role in athletes. And so their glucose tolerance reduced significantly by 40%. They were now behaving as if they were diabetics. But here, this is a slide that I often show to athletes because I think most people can relate to it. So in our lab at Henry Ford, we compare the impairment that you get from sleep deprivation, and we compare it to the impairment from drinking alcohol. So if you get 6 hours of sleep, that's equivalent to drinking 2 to 3 beers. If you get 4 hours of sleep, that's about 6 beers, which is above the legal limit in some states, and so on and so forth. Now, raise your hand here if you've ever come to work, showed up at a training room, or come to play a sport after drinking 2 to 3 beers. You don't count. Now raise your hand if you've ever shown up to work after getting less than 8 hours of sleep. We've all done that, right? We do that because we think we can get by with less sleep. Well, I'm here to tell you, no, you can't. Your elite athletes are not in the business of getting by. They want to win more games. And for that, you need more sleep. So I'm going to switch gears here and talk about how much sleep we need to win. Again, for adult humans, we need about, on an average, we say 7 to 8 hours of sleep. But athletes need about 9 to 10 hours of sleep to perform at their level best. And this data is done from the sleep extension studies that are done on Stanford athletes. So the experiment is really, really simple. What they do is they take Stanford athletes, and for a period of 6 weeks, they make sure that they get 10 hours in bed. They make them wear, actigraphs. They make them keep a sleep diary, and they look at performance measures towards the end of the 6 weeks. So, for example, in basketball players, there was significant reduction in the sprint times, but also their shooting accuracy increased. So there was a 9% increase in free throws and a 9% increase in three-point field goals. Similar, and then during the day, when they're out of the field, they were less sleepy, they were happier, they were less grumpy. They said their mood was better, they weren't as tired. So which are all things that are really important, because mental perception of how you're going to do is actually very, very important. So one of the things that mental fatigue does to you is that you go in thinking you're not going to do it very well. And that's a bad thing, because that affects your actual performance. So this was then repeated in the football players. The Stanford football players, they extended their sleep to 10 hours, or time in bed for 10 hours for 6 weeks. And they shaved off 1.12 seconds off their 40-yard dash, as well as their 20-yard shuttle. Now, I just gave a talk to the NFL Combine, and these figures, they seem really, really tiny, but success in sports right now is measured in milliseconds and milli-inches. This is, these are profound improvements in performance. There was a similar study in Stanford swimmers. There was a significant decrease in the average turn time. They added 5 kicks to their kick strokes. Similarly, tennis players, there was a significant increase in serve accuracy. So that leads us to tell athletes that athletes need 9 to 10 hours of sleep on a regular basis. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about what drives alertness and performance, the science behind that. So the first thing that happens is the one process that regulates sleep and wakefulness is your homeostatic drive, or the amount you've been awake. That drives how sleepy you're going to be. So for example, when you wake up in the morning, say you wake up at, not going to work. So you wake up at, say, 6 or 7 in the morning. By the time 10 or 11 o'clock rolls around, you have 16 to 17 hours of wakefulness that accumulate, right? When you fall asleep, you consume the sleep drive. So this is one process that drives how awake or sleepy you are going to be during the day. All the things I've described so far, that's what it's all about. How long you've been awake. So for example, if you guys came in late, one of you flew in late last night and got less sleep, then your sleep load was already increased by the time you woke up in the morning, and so it would be more, and that would affect your performance the next day. But in addition to this, there is a clock in our brain, and that is your circadian clock. And what this clock does is it secretes an alerting signal, which opposes the sleep drive. There is a slight dip in the mid-afternoon. There are about 3 people sleeping in the audience. It's not me. It's that dip in the afternoon in your alertness. And then it increases. And then in the presence of darkness, melatonin is secreted. It dampens your sleep drive, your wake drive, and this is how you maintain sleep. Now, why is this important? Well, so in fact, every cell in your body and every physiological function has a circadian rhythm. So all the physiological functions that actually affect performance have a circadian rhythm. So things like the timing of the hormone secretions, things like your best coordination time, fastest reaction time, greatest cardiovascular efficiency and muscle strength, they tend to peak in the evening. So there's a certain time during the day when this is at its maximum. So what does that mean for sports? So my colleagues Smith and Malhotra, they looked at 40 years of NFL data. So they looked at the last 40 years, and they looked at evening games where East Coast was playing against the West Coast. And they found that the West Coast beat the Las Vegas point spread twice as often and won twice as often games as compared to the East Coast. Of course, there was no significant difference during the daytime games. That's because during the evening, the West Coast is always playing at their biological performance, peak performance. And the East Coast teams are at a disadvantage. So, and this is a very robust study. I mean, this is 40 years of data. It takes into account the quality of the team, the amount of travel. So the homeostatic drive really doesn't matter. It was just the circadian advantage. Well, and similarly, in baseball, this is a study that came out recently. Now, 5-6 years ago, there was a study that looked at two separate things. The first thing it looked at was that if you were crossing 3 time zones to get to wherever you were going to play, then your likelihood of losing the first game was 60% or more. The second thing they found is that people who are morning pitchers who are morning people tend to pitch better during day games. And pitchers who are night owls tend to pitch better in evening games, which sort of intuitively makes sense because that's where their peak performance is. It's different for different people. So what this study looked at is, again, looked at 20 years of games, and they looked at East Coast teams which were coming home. Now, home field advantage is about 3.9%. And what they found is that when East Coast teams actually came home, they were now out of sync with their own rhythm. And so they nullified that home field advantage. And so they were not winning as much. And this was when they were playing against away games which were coming from the same time zone. So that's how profound this effect of circadian rhythm is on performance. So what is your chronotype? So one of the things that your clock, that biological clock decides is whether you're a night owl or you're a morning lark. Now raise your hands if you're a night owl. 30-40% of the audience. Raise your hand if you think you're a morning person. And does anybody think they're kind of intermediate? So you can see, I mean, even in this audience, there is a distribution of whether you're a night owl or a morning person or an intermediate. So everybody's peak performance, you would think, would differ, right? So far what we know is that they look at peak performance and they find that mostly it peaks in the late afternoon. So this is a study, this is done at the University of Birmingham, and what they did is that they looked at competition level athletes and they administered this paper and pencil test, which is a morning evening questionnaire. And so they can now divide them into early, intermediate, or late night owls. And then they do performance tests, and they do them 6 times during the day. So the performance test that they perform is something called the bleep test, which is a test for endurance. It measures oxygen uptake. They also do sprint times, and they ask for what the people think how they're performing. So when you look at this, when they looked at the data, they found that as a group, as a whole, the group would say, yes, the peak performance occurs between 4 and 7. The lowest peak performance was at 7 in the morning, and then it was intermediate at 10 a.m., 10 p.m., and 1 in the afternoon. But when you divided them into groups of early, intermediate, and late chronotypes, they found that early chronotypes peaked earlier during the day, so between noon and 2. If you were intermediate, it was the mid-afternoon. If you're late chronotype, you peaked much later, between 7 and 8 in the evening. Now, why is that important? Well, when you think about team performance, for a team to perform very well, you want each individual to perform at their peak level. You want them to perform their level best. So they also looked at teams. So this was, again, out of the same group, and they looked at, okay, let me go back here. The other thing that they looked at also is how did they perform depending on what time they woke up. So So since all of us had to be here at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm assuming most people woke up between 6 and 7, right? It didn't matter if you were a night owl. It didn't matter if you were a late night person. That's the time you had to wake up because, by God, you had to be here. So that, the time you wake up or you're entrained to wake up is something that happens when, we often don't take into account what our chronotypes are. So the other thing they looked at is they looked at peak performance as it compares to the time they woke up, and they found that for early and intermediate chronotypes, they peaked about 6 to 7 hours after their waking up time. For late chronotypes, they were peaking 11 hours or later after they woke up. So again, it doesn't really, if your coach is asking everybody to come in at 6 and wake up at 6 and be there at 7, that doesn't mean your peak performance is going to be at the same time. So the same group then looked at a larger number of athletes that were divided into 12 teams, and they predicted performance depending on whether they were made of early, intermediate, or late chronotypes. And they found that these teams, their peak performance differed depending on what the individual performance, what the individual phenotype or chronotype was. So, for example, T3, which was mostly late night owls, they peaked later during the day, versus T10, which were mostly early morning people, they peaked early in the morning. So, that's just very interesting, because if T3 was playing against T10 and the game was in the morning, T3 would be at a biological disadvantage. If the game was in the evening, then T3 would be at an advantage then, because depending on where you're at. So I'm going to end here, because I'm sure you guys have everybody has a lot of questions. But here are my take-home points. First, being an elite is a 24-hour commitment. It's not just what you do on the field. It's leading up to the team. Now, I know that going to bed on time, getting your 9 hours in bed, sometimes doesn't gel with the rock star image we have of elite athletes. But there are some rock star elite athletes who do get 9 hours in bed. Tom Brady, LeBron James. The second thing is that there is no compromising on sleep, as these deficits are cumulative and non-recoverable. So just 2 days before the game, not going to do it. You really have to get enough sleep on a regular basis. Thirdly, sleep affects all the key factors that contribute to athletic performance. So, you think about diet, hydration, I hope I've shown you, it does affect each and every aspect of your performance. Now, here's what happened. Many years ago, when greenies or amphetamines and steroids were allowed or not banned in sport, many of the effects of sleep deprivation were masked because of that. We don't do that anymore. So, which is why, you want to make sure you get your regular 9 to 10 hours. And then finally, in a world where we are looking to best our individual and team performance, circadian advantage is a yet unexplored and a very manageable variable. Okay, so with that, I'm going to end. Yes?
I'm curious, there are some sports, I'm thinking of swimming in particular, where there's sort of a culture, like if you're a swimmer, a serious swimmer, you're getting up and having like 6 a.m. practices or things like that. I wonder if anyone has done any research looking at like changing that. Like, would swimmers do better if they weren't getting up so early, or have there been experiments where they tested sort of time of training?
Right. So, any sport which is limited by the facility use, like swimmers, ice hockey, tennis players, where they have to be there because that's the only time they can get to the sport, that's when sleep deprivation really gets aggravated, because now they have to be, especially if you're a college athlete, you have to be at school later, that's the only time you can work out, or that's the only time you can swim. Yes, in fact, many of the sleep deprivation studies were done in swimmers initially, and they found that, just by extending reducing the amount they were sleeping, they were swimming in the morning and sleeping more, that did show an improvement in their performance.
So is there any sort of like, equation of figuring out like, and this is something that I think sub-elite athletes will have to think about, the busy people who are trying to train for trying to qualify for Boston Marathon, let's say. Is it better
I would say get that extra sleep, for sure. Yes.
So she talked a lot of, or she asked a question that kind of brought on like when to train. Is there a huge correlation between like, you talked about like their peak performances have a lot to do with their chronotypes. Does training during those times of day also have more benefit than?
Absolutely, yes. Training during the time, during your peak performance, yes, is going to be better. Also, in fact, you know, sleep is very important for learning, for consolidating the memory you formed during training, whether it's muscle memory or it's, you know, it's something that you learned, paper, pencil, all of that gets, all that consolidation occurs better if you're sleeping. So in fact, taking a nap after that training would also do you good. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
You spoke about sleep as just as a quantity, but what about quality of sleep? Does that were you able to measure that and see if that had any effect on performance as well?
So in this study, in the sleep extension studies, they did not really actually measure sleep. They measured time in bed and inferred that if they were spending, you know, they were sleeping more, it would be better. But really, when you talk about sleep quality, you're talking about two separate things. Number one, you're talking about, you know, whether they reached all the four stages of sleep, whether they were able to go into deep sleep, because we know that's where growth hormone is secreted. And the quantity matters. So yes, both quality as well as quantity of sleep is good. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I understand the sort of peak performance point, but how do you understand, or how do you sort of drill down to the people that need 8 hours and people that need 9 hours? That there are some people that seem to need more sleep than others. Is there a way to kind of understand that in more granularity, or is that not really understandable?
Well, so, you know, the difference between, so there are two separate things that we're talking about. Number one is when people say that they can get by with, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 hours of sleep versus somebody who says, well, I need 8 or 9 hours of sleep. Really, the difference is not whether one person needs more sleep versus the other. It's that one person is able to get by with less sleep, so they're able to tolerate that sleep deprivation better than the other. So does that make sense? So that's the first thing. The second thing to understand is that when you sleep deprive yourself on a chronic basis, you sort of lose your reference. So you no longer realize what it is, what it felt to be awake and alert. And that is why you say, well, you know, I'm fine on 5 or 6 hours of sleep. And so and because you think you're going to be fine on 5 or 6 hours of sleep, you never really help extend your sleep time. Well, you know, you say, well, I need only 5 to 6 hours of sleep. But one good way to tell whether you're getting enough sleep or not is to find out if you ever sleep extend on your days off or on the weekends. Because that means that on a regular basis, you're not getting enough sleep, and that is why you're playing catch up. Yes?
How was this information received at the compound?
They were very interested. So I presented to the physician league, the physician society meeting. And, you know, when I go in and I talk to athletes or I talk to teams, about a third of them are already, you know, good athletes already intuitively are doing this. You know, another third of them really, they want to try, they want to make sure that they get enough time in bed. And then about a third are not interested. Yes? Yes, you can do that. You can. It takes a lot of discipline. So what happens is that your biological clock is most affected by light. So you can use light boxes. In addition, you can use melatonin. So for example, when we send the lions to London, you know, we had to shift their clock to make them go to bed earlier. And so we used, you know, both light as well as melatonin. Yes. Sir.
Yes. So you mentioned the word nap. And so how important is it to get to sleep contiguously overnight, or can you make up some deficits with, you know, shorter sleep?
You can totally make up. Yes, that's a very good question. So when I say 9 hours in bed, I mean 9 hours over a 24-hour period. So if you can't get all of that sleep in one go, then yes, go ahead, take a nap. So when we talk about strategic napping, there are really 3 different kind of naps that you can take. So you can either take a 15 to 20-minute nap and wake up. Because if you wake up within 15, 20 minutes, you wake up from light sleep, you should feel refreshed. You can, or you can take a 30-minute nap. And again, in a 30-minute nap, of course, you wake up from maybe stage 2, which is still light sleep, which is fine. Or you take a granddaddy nap, which is a 90-minute nap, which is, when you go through your light sleep, deep sleep, dream sleep, and then you spontaneously wake up. Now, remember, if you're having issues with sleeping at night, then in those cases, I say nap is not a good thing, because then you're taking away from that sleep drive, your homeostatic drive. But typically, athletes, if they're having issues with falling asleep, it's because of 2 reasons. Either they're trying to go to sleep at a time which is not their normal bedtime because they've, crossed 4 time zones to be at a different place, or they've been drinking a lot of caffeine right before because their games are in the evening, and that interrupts their sleep. I think we're out of time.